Three men armed with spears and bows were slowly making their way through the dense undergrowth of the Amazon jungle. Two of them were carrying a pole with the carcass of a wild pig tied to it. The hunt was successful. The men were feeling joyful. They wore almost no clothing except for loincloths. Those were the natives who were living along the banks of the Amazon for generations. Their settlement was so remote that they had no knowledge of the existence of civilization elsewhere. They lived as their ancestors had, hunting in these lands for countless generations. The pig's carcass was heavy, so the men had to take breaks approximately every half mile. Sweat was pouring down their strong, muscular bodies, and their legs were aching from exhaustion. But all this paled in comparison to the joy they anticipated to see in the eyes of their fellow tribesmen when they saw the catch. The first man was the scout, while the other two carried the pig's carcass on a long pole. They occasionally switched positions to share the burden. The scout cleared the path, which had become overgrown since the last rainy season. Suddenly, the leading tribesmen stopped and started listening intently. The men carrying the carcass continued a few more yards before coming to a halt and looking at the scout with interest. He had clearly heard something, and the tense expression on his face was proof of that. The man cautiously parted the foliage with his hands, revealing a strange sight. In a small clearing lay a woman dressed in some very unusual clothes. Although it was only the natives who saw her clothes as strange, since it was almost ordinary modern attire. Soon, the other two men joined the scout, staring in amazement at the unexpected marvel. They had never encountered someone from the civilized world before, so they were unsure how to react. Overwhelmed, the natives stood frozen in place, watching the motionless woman as if she were a deity that had descended from the heavens. Lacking any experience with such encounters, the men exchanged worried glances. The eldest among them eventually suggested taking the woman back to their settlement. Since the stranger was unconscious, they would need to carry her on a makeshift stretcher made from branches bound together with vines. But what would they do with the pig's carcass then? They couldn't leave it to the mercy of the forest predators. The leader of the three men made the only logical decision. While two of them would carry the woman to the village on a makeshift stretcher, the third would remain behind to guard the pig's carcass, awaiting reinforcements. When the natives placed the woman on the stretcher, she let out a muffled groan and briefly opened her eyes. Startled, the hunters nearly dropped the stretcher. But when the stranger closed her eyes again, they relaxed and quickened their pace. As they made their way through the forest, the natives noticed an enormous object, something that hadn't been there before. From a distance, it resembled either a massive, shining bird or some humongous insect. Had the natives been at least somewhat familiar with civilization, they would have immediately realized that it wasn't some unknown species of huge birds, but a helicopter that had crashed. But they had no such knowledge and hurried to pass the strange and dangerous-looking object. Their familiar world was collapsing before them, the world in which they were born and raised, the one where they knew every forest path and thicket. Fortunately, carrying the woman on the makeshift stretcher wasn't very hard. She was a petite woman weighing very little, which lifted the spirits of the two natives. Finally, their home village came into view, and the men breathed sighs of relief. When the tribe's elder saw the woman lying on the stretcher, he felt uneasy. However, the old man couldn't show weakness because in such a case, he wouldn't be able to expect respect from his fellow tribesmen. The women of the tribe immediately surrounded the stranger, marveling at her strange clothing. Meanwhile, the village elder found a local shaman and asked him to examine the guest. The man took a pouch of herbs and approached the stranger. Then he asked the villagers to leave him alone with the woman. The shaman turned out to be quite knowledgeable, and after considering several remedies, found the right one. It acted like smelling salts, reviving a person in an unconscious state. Upon smelling the pungent herb, the woman wrinkled her nose, sneezed funnily, and opened her eyes. The shaman smiled and immediately offered her to smell the healing substance again. But once was enough for the woman to fully regain consciousness. She shook her head and pushed the shaman's hand away. Seeing that the stranger had risen to her feet, the villagers immediately formed a circle around her. The woman's name was Monica, but she had no idea how to communicate this information to the tribespeople, especially since their language was incomprehensible to her. To Monica's surprise, the village inhabitants turned out to be rather kind people who brought her fruits and roasted meat. It was only then, in the presence of all of this culinary splendor, that she realized how hungry she really was. Apparently, Monica's young body was actively recovering from the injury she had sustained, which had sparked her ravenous appetite. Seeing that the woman didn't refuse the food, the tribespeople smiled and started dancing around her. Monica expected that this was all part of some ritual, which she found herself liking more and more. After satisfying her hunger, Monica thanked the tribespeople with a polite half-bow, which seemed to have made them even happier. Finally, when the initial excitement gradually subsided, the elder approached Monica, took her by the hand, and led her to an empty hut. "Maybe he wants me to rest," Monica guessed and smiled at the old man. Lying on the hard cot, Monica Donahue mentally traveled back to a time when there was no jungle in her life, only the vast ranches of Texas. The woman never knew her father, but according to her mother, he was a wealthy landowner who died in a tragic accident in the Colorado mountains. Catherine Donahue had received several farms as her inheritance, as well as hundreds of acres of land and thousands of cattle. Young Catherine had to go through a lot before achieving financial independence and prosperity. When Monica grew up, she became actively involved in the family business, helping her mother in every endeavor. But what happened later completely changed their lives forever. It all began when Catherine Donahue met a man. Howard Price was a charming man with graying temples who immediately captured the heart of the naive woman who had long longed for male attention. The courtship and romantic dates didn't last long. They culminated into a grand wedding that surprised many of the locals. At first, Monica treated her stepfather with due respect and even sympathy. However, as Howard delved deeper into the intricacies of the family business, Monica realized that this handsome man wasn't as simple as he seemed at first. Of course, Monica tried to warn her mother about the danger, but all of her efforts were in vain. Catherine believed that her daughter was simply jealous of her stepfather, thinking that she had been left without her mother's attention. However, even Monica couldn't foresee what would happen just a month after the wedding. While driving her SUV, Catherine went over the speed limit and crashed through the protective barrier, plummeting into a ravine. The initial investigation suggested that the businesswoman had simply lost control of the car. But when experts examined Catherine's car, they discovered that the entire braking system had inexplicably failed. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, but Monica knew that her mother's car had passed all the necessary inspections at the service center shortly before the accident. At Catherine's funeral, Howard delivered moving words and wept openly. All those present bowed their heads in grief, and only Monica felt that her stepfather's sorrow was noticeably fake. That show was intended to deceive the gullible public, which only saw a grieving widower and not the wealthy landowner that Howard had become after his wife's tragic death. Having decided to take a closer look at her stepfather, Monica began to monitor his every move. It's hard to say if Howard sensed the surveillance or not, but when he suggested that his stepdaughter go on a tour to the Amazon, she didn't suspect any foul play. For convenience, Howard suggested using a private helicopter to transport Monica to the tourist camp located deep in the lush rainforests. The stepfather promised to arrive shortly afterward, citing his heavy workload. If Monica had only known what Howard had in store for her, she would have never set foot in that ill-fated helicopter. Howard's plan became clear half an hour into the flight when the co-pilot handed her a document that turned out to be a copy of her will. "What is this? What does Howard have planned? Why do I need to sign a will?" the frightened woman exclaimed. The man smirked and then added, "Oh, come on, all you need to do is sign it. Howard will take care of the rest. From now on, he will be the sole owner of the Donahue family assets." Monica turned pale and then crumpled the piece of paper, tossing it out of the slightly opened window. At that moment, a struggle ensued between her and Howard's henchmen. Monica understood that according to her stepfather's plan, this flight was supposed to be her last. Howard clearly intended to pass it off as an accident. But it didn't go exactly as he planned. In the heat of the struggle, Howard's henchmen accidentally bumped into the pilot, causing him to lose control of the helicopter. Within seconds, the helicopter began to rapidly lose altitude. The pilot did everything he could to keep the helicopter in the air, but it still plummeted to the ground. During the crash, both the pilot and Howard's henchmen died, and only Monica managed to survive. She waited for help for about 2 days, and then she set off to try and find help herself. Dehydration set in very quickly when Monica had only moved about a mile away from the helicopter crash site. That was where she was discovered by a group of hunters from the local tribe. Of course, Monica couldn't tell them her story because she didn't know the local language. However, the tribespeople turned out to be uncurious and kind-hearted. In fact, they believed Monica to be a deity that descended from the heavens and were determined to hold on to this theory. Monica lived with the tribe for about a week, after which she realized she needed to return home. However, she would require the assistance of the locals to do that. To avoid getting lost in the dense jungle, Monica decided to embark on a journey on a makeshift raft. Initially, the tribespeople didn't understand what Monica wanted from them. But when she used a piece of liana to bind together several branches and demonstrated a model of a raft, they figured out what she needed. It took 3 days of strenuous work to build the raft. The tribespeople understood that Monica had come from another world and now intended to go back there. The farewell moment on the riverbank was very touching. The women of the tribe cried, and the men raised their spears with sorrowful expressions on their faces. Monica floated on the raft for about 2 days, and then she arrived at one of the fishing settlements. Those were Europeans who immediately provided her with assistance and called the police. Monica recounted everything without holding back, vividly describing Howard's crimes. On the same day, she was put on a private plane that brought her back to her native Texas. Needless to say, Monica's stepfather was stunned to see his stepdaughter at the door, as he clearly believed that she had died in the helicopter crash. Seeing that Monica arrived with the police, Howard understood everything without words and decided to surrender. Having given a full confession, he admitted his involvement in Catherine Donahue's death and the attempted murder of his stepdaughter. Now that Howard was awaiting trial, Monica took the reins of the family business in her own hands, intending to run it in a way that would make her late parents proud.